But of course, the explanations that Putin is giving to the general public is that Russia is actually fighting with the West, with NATO as a whole, and that this explains why, these advances are taking place, and therefore that, it isn't really the Ukrainians on their own. It is really a result of sort of the collective West, which is fighting against Russia, which is trying to undermine Russia.
Now, Ukrainian troops are reportedly advancing further into Russia's Kursk region on what is now the 8th day of their counter-invasion. But Russian forces have been striking back with missiles, drones and airstrikes. It's the biggest attack on sovereign Russian territory since the war began. Joining us now to discuss this is Senior Lecturer in Security and Development at King's College London. That's Domitilla Sagramoso. Domitilla, thank you very much for your time this evening. Ukraine, they've got a decision to make. Zelensky has a decision to make. Do they stay put? Do they withdraw? From what we're seeing that Zelensky's doing, what do we think his plan is?
Well, I don't think there is really a plan to withdraw at all. I think the plan is to try to hold as much territory as possible, to advance further. I think probably the objective is to hold land which is close to the border because it's easier to protect and defend, and to see if eventually this can have an impact on the whole military operation of Russia in other parts of the front. So one of the aims is, of course, to try to see if forces can be diverted from other areas where the attacks from the Russian side are quite intense. And this is especially the case in the Donbass, and to see if eventually, if more land is taken, this can be part of a process of negotiations where there is some kind of exchange of land and territory. But of course, the area that is under Ukrainian control at the moment is significant in terms of the advances that were carried out so quickly, but it's not so huge if we compare it with the amount of territory that is under Russian control in Ukraine.
And given that, how much of a bargaining chip is it?
It is a relative bargaining chip because on the one hand, this is the first time that Russians are seeing, military operations and combat on their territory. And this is forcing, for example, the evacuation of citizens, the collapse of administration structures, whole sort of difficulties along the areas that are under now Ukrainian control. So it is very significant from the point of view of the Russian government. This is a sort of an important blow, which forces the Russian government to try to address this issue more urgently than other areas on the front line. So it is an important element which could be part of a negotiation, but it's still, I think, too early to tell whether this is going to be an effective sort of bargaining chip for the areas that are under Russian control. If we look at the size of the territories that are under Russian control in Ukraine, they are much bigger. And the Russians are advancing in many of these areas, especially in the areas in the Donbass, near Chasiv Yar, near Konstantinovka, near Pokrovsk. So, the situation is sort of mixed from the Ukrainian point of view if we look at the entire front line.
But this is, I guess, a significant morale booster, isn't it, for the Ukrainians, and particularly that the frustration and the humiliation in Russia for those, over 100,000 residents who've had to evacuate. What is the messaging that Putin is putting across via Russian state television to Russian residents? How's he explaining this?
Well, let me just confirm what you just said. From the Ukrainian point of view, this is a very important move because it takes the initiative, away from Russia. So now Russia is in the position where it has to react. But of course, the explanations that Putin is giving to the general public is that Russia is actually fighting with the West, with NATO as a whole, and that this explains why, these advances are taking place, and therefore that, it isn't really the Ukrainians on their own. It is really a result of sort of the collective West, which is fighting against Russia, which is trying to undermine Russia, which is trying to impose what we call as a strategic defeat on Russia. You see that a lot in the press, this idea that the West wants to completely weaken Russia and ensure that it is defeated strategically. There is even concern that Russia, that the West wants to sort of destroy Russia. And so this narrative is used very much by the Russian leadership to explain why, they are facing these challenges. But of course, it is not sufficient. And I think part of the public is not really buying it. And we saw that when we looked at the reactions of many of the so-called military bloggers. The Russian military bloggers were the ones providing a lot of the information in the initial stages of this incursion, and they were expressing great disbelief, especially at the fact that there was this intelligence failure, because the information apparently was there that there was this concentration of forces on the border by the Ukrainian armed forces, and nothing was really done about it. So there was a lot of criticism. So I think that any of these sort of arguments that, in a way, Russia is not to blame is not really working. And there is now interesting sort of rearrangement of who is going to be in charge of this operation to dislodge the Ukrainians from the areas that they occupy. And what is very interesting is that Dumin is a person who's been put in charge. He's actually a person very loyal to President Putin. He was part of his sort of bodyguard structure. So Putin is relying overall on the management of this operation on people he feels that he can trust entirely, because probably he feels very disappointed by the way that the military have been handling this situation.
Yeah. What we've heard from Ukraine today is they said they're not interested in taking territory, but they would stay there and hold it until Moscow agrees peace. I mean, it kind of goes back to what I said to you there about to what extent this is a bargaining chip. How close are we to a situation where some sort of peace would either be engineered by military force or by negotiation?
This is a very interesting point, because Putin has been saying for several times now that he was ready to negotiate, and it was the Ukrainians who were not willing to engage in negotiations. Whereas now he's saying, Ukraine wants to use this as a bargaining chip, which is probably part of the rationale behind this operation. But I think that, for Putin to accept any kind of exchange of territories at this stage is very difficult to accept. And I think the Ukrainians are playing on that, are trying to sort of hit Russia hard enough so as to force Russia into some kind of compromise. And I think both Zelensky and Putin probably understand that, that a significant change along the sort of the line of control or the front line is very difficult to achieve. Up until now, the Russians were advancing, but they were advancing very slowly with a high number of casualties and significant losses of equipment and manpower as well. And the Ukrainians were also having trouble with issues around manpower. Of course, we know equipment, which was arriving from the West quite slowly. So I think both sides know that eventually they may need to sit at the negotiating table. The question is, when is that going to happen, and when this famous sort of hurting stalemate is reached? And I think we're still not there. I think we are still not at this juncture now, but we might be reaching it if the Ukrainians manage to advance further and force the Russians into some kind of compromise solution.